How's it going? Adam Drake here, and today we're going to talk a little bit about setup basics. Everyone wants to always have the magical setup. Everyone thinks if they had the right setup, they're going to be able to produce the best lap times. This is true. Setup is very important. It does matter. But a lot of times people will overlook the small details when setting up their car. They're going to be super concerned or worried about the diff fluid, the shock oil, the pistons, all of that stuff, which again, it's all very important. Every part of the setup is really important. But what I want to share with you guys today is that don't overlook the basics. Things like ride height, camber, toe, brake bias. Those things are far, far more important to your setup than the actual diff fluid. And the reason why I say that is, we'll talk about brakes for a little bit. If your brake linkage is off and you have no front brake and a lot of rear brake, it doesn't matter what's in your front diff. When you go into the corner and you tap the brakes, the car is going to want to spin out. The rear end is going to want to basically pass the front end because you have no braking force from the front tires. The opposite of that can happen if you have too much front brake and very little or no rear brake. Again, it doesn't really matter what's in your front diff or your rear diff for that matter. If you hit the brakes and you have a ton of front brake and no rear brake, the car is not going to want to steer getting into the corner until you release the brakes. So again, we're all looking for that magical setup, but let's not forget about the basics. Brakes are super, super important. Your linkage is super important. I have videos on both of those. Another thing that's really, really important and a lot of times overlooked is your ride height. And it's not just having the right ride height, it's also setting your ride height correctly. So I'm going to kind of go over how I set my ride height really quick. So for me, I always like to have my car, truck, race ready. So wing, body, tires, wheels, full tank of gas. Now, you can set the ride height with a half tank, with an empty tank, whatever works best for you. The reason why I always choose to do a full tank of fuel is because it's the easiest to duplicate. If you do a half a tank and maybe you didn't get quite as much, that's going to change the amount of weight on the front of the car. It's also going to change the ride height. Now, there's so many different methods. Some guys will just push the car down, let it come back up, slide the gauge under. Some will drop it. Some drop it and then tap it twice. There's really not a set way that it has to be done. The biggest thing is that the ride height needs to be set in a consistent manner. So always on a setup board, always with the tires, everything race ready. What I like to do is drop the car from about 6 inches, but when I drop the car, also let it slightly roll. Because if you drop the car just straight down, sometimes when the wheels kind of scrub in, it'll make the car almost stay stuck down. But if you drop the car and let it slightly roll, it will kind of level out and seems to be the most consistent. I use the Mugen ride height gauge. There's a lot of gauges out there. But another key part when setting the ride height is always being consistent where you're checking that measurement from. Some guys like to go kind of from the middle of the car and check it at the C block, and then for the front, come from the center of the car and check it at the B block. For me, you always want to check the ride height where the chassis flattens out. So the chassis has kick in the front. So basically, right at the B block or just slightly behind the B block is where you're going to want to check the ride height in the front. And in the back, you always want to check the ride height at the D block, so at the very back tip of the chassis. And the reason for that is, in most cases, especially with a four-wheel drive vehicle, you'll always have a little bit of rake. So you'll always have the chassis to where the front is slightly lower than the rear. If you're checking the ride height at the D block, I'm sorry, at the C block versus the D block, that's almost 2 inches that the chassis is at that angle. So checking it at the C block is going to be slightly lower than if you check it at the D block. So if you're going off someone's setup, you may want to make sure that you're checking the ride height the same way that they do. For me, this is the way that I always do it. But again, you can do it multiple different ways. So I'll just drop the car, let it roll, kind of settle, slide it under the front of the chassis, and check. I'm at 25 millimeters. That's kind of my standard for Nitro Buggy, between 24 and 25 millimeters. I'll move to the back of the car. The very back tip of the chassis is at 26 millimeters. So I'm also going to check it at the C block just to kind of see the difference. And it's about almost 2 millimeters difference between checking it at the C versus the D block. So ride height is super, super important to the way that your car handles. If the ride height's too high, it's going to want to catch bumps, flip. It's not going to drive and kind of be in the track. It's going to be more on top of the track. So I have tons and tons of videos talking about different setups and how to kind of tune and dial your car in. That should be really helpful. But try not to forget about the basics. Again, your brake bias is super important. Your linkage is really important in order to have the proper feel and power band. Your ride height is super important. And also your camber, toe, and then your endpoints for your steering. Another thing along those lines, especially on pillow ball style cars, guys sometimes will freak out a little bit about what the number or the degrees of camber. And it is nice to have that for reference. Typically, you run your off-road cars with -2 to -3 degrees of camber. But camber is also really important. But for me, that number isn't what's important. It's how the car drives when it goes around the track. So for me, I have kind of a baseline or set numbers for my rear camber link, which is normally between 19.8 and 20.2 millimeters. My steering links, which normally I run between 28.2 and 28.5, and that's going to change the toe out. Always want to run some toe out for a four-wheel drive car. And then for the camber, I almost always run one 1 millimeter washer for the upper and the lower front arm. Now, I don't even know exactly what that number of camber comes out to, but if I want to make an adjustment, that number doesn't matter. I can remove a washer from the upper front arm. We have 1/2 mil washers. A couple companies also make little like half washer clips that can go in there. But again, don't get too caught up or too worried about what the actual numbers or trying to be too technical, because you can drive yourself crazy a little bit, especially when you're trying to set the front toe and camber, because if the radio's not on, the wheels aren't perfectly straight, your ride height's not set, it's not on a setup board, all those numbers are going to vary or change slightly. So on most of my setup sheets, I have it marked with the 1 millimeter for the upper and lower, the 28.3 range for the steering, and the 20 millimeter range for the rear camber links.